Hello and welcome to About Books. Joining me today is author Sue O'Connell, the author of this new book, The Man Who Saved FC Barcelona, The Remarkable Life of Patrick O'Connell. Welcome, Sue.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Now, same surname. Shall we start there? Is there a family connection?
There is indeed. Patrick O'Connell was my husband's grandfather.
Right.
But my husband never met his grandfather, which is rather sad.
It does sound sad. And is that addressed in the book?
We found out how it happened, why it happened, various ideas as to why it happened. Patrick abandoned his family. The family had come over from Dublin and for football. He moved from Dublin to Sheffield Wednesday, from Sheffield Wednesday to Hull City, and from Hull City to Manchester United.
Manchester United?
That's right.
Yeah. Did he ever play for any Merseyside teams? Shall we establish this at the start?
No.
Okay,
He
so
didn't.
forgive us.
Yes, sorry. I thought it might be a bit difficult. Will people let me out of here alive if I talk about Manchester United? Blame it on my husband.
So he played for Manchester United?
He played for Manchester United in the 1914-15 season. He was signed. Beginning of 1915, he became captain of Manchester United.
Right. Right, that's interesting. Now, the thing about Patrick O'Connell is that I have in the past, for my sins, been a Manchester United fan. And I'd never heard of him before I met you. And yet he'd captained for a few years, I think, United.
Well, he
right?
captained at the start of the First World War.
Yeah.
And officially he captained right the way through the First World War, although the league system was more or less suspended for the time.
Because of the war.
Because of the war, yes.
And he also played for his country, Ireland?
He played for Ireland on 6 occasions. He had 6 international caps. He was very highly thought of.
Yeah.
He was a very good footballer.
Yeah. And this is the story of those times. Yeah? He also, as it tells us in the title, saved FC Barcelona.
He did indeed. During the Spanish Civil War, things were dire, things were terrible. Of course, with the FC Barcelona, people were being drafted into the army.
Right.
So there were fewer spectators and there were fewer players. So at very short notice, they'd have to find somebody else to play centre half or whatever, because he was signed up and drafted off. So it was a terrible time for them. And Patrick, to his credit, talk about a decrease in salary. So it decreased by 1/3.
Right, as manager?
Yeah, as
Right.
manager.
Right, yeah.
And they went off to Mexico, played a series of games, played in Cuba, went to New York, and they gathered enough money to keep the club going. So when they went back to Spain, back to Barcelona, there was money to keep them afloat when basically the Catalans lost in the Civil War.
Right. Well, we'll come back to that then in a bit, because there's obviously a lot going on in the book.
Yeah.
Well, I know I've read the book and there is a lot going on in it. I wanted to just start out by asking you about your own writing journey. How did you get into writing?
How did I get into writing? Well, when I was about 12, I made up my mind I was going to be a writer. And I told my mother, and she said, you have to have something to write about before you can write. And so I put it on hold. But all the time, in the back of my mind, even though I did completely different things, I got this idea that I wanted to write. But I have multiple sclerosis. I had to retire. And I got a little bit better. I came out of the relapse I'd been in. And said, well, good as anything, find out about Patrick. Now this was a long time ago. It was, dare I say it, pre-personal computers.
Right.
So everything had to be done. If you wrote a letter, you couldn't email it, you had to actually post it or fax it. So it took ages to find out what Patrick had been doing. His daughter, who we used to see quite a lot of now, she had these wonderful stories. He was the most wonderful footballer that ever trod the planet. And had to find out what was true and what wasn't, and what he'd done and what he hadn't done, and what she'd invented or thought he might have done. So bit by bit, I pieced together his life, and then I could slot in what he did in his personal life.
Right.
into the
right.
framework.
So this book is actually based on your personal experience of his family and the stories that were told to you.
That's right.
Right. So that must be quite rare that a writer has that kind of access to their subject.
Well, it was very fortunate, I should think. It was very interesting, but I also had to try and sort fact from fiction.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because it's would you describe it as a fictionalised biography?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Because there are gaps in his life that you don't know about. Is that right? Am I getting that right?
No, that's quite right. Gaps, I don't know anything about what was happening, but what I've tried to do is do a sort of educated guess.
Right. Yeah.
Given that I know what happened before, what happened afterwards, and I got a feeling for the man.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So you kind of predicted what he might have been doing.
Yeah.
So where are the gaps in the story? Are they in his young life or later on? Do you know more about his younger life or more about his later life?
Well, the very end of his life, like the last sort of 5 or 6 years, I don't really know very much, but I can surmise, make an educated guess. At the very early years, again, I'm not too sure, but given that he was always playing sport, a good idea. And he seems to have been quite successful in everything he did.
Yeah, and I suppose it helped that because you know it's documented the sort of journey he made through British clubs and Irish clubs, and then he trolled off to Spain, didn't he?
Cleared
So I
off to
suppose
Spain,
you've got that pattern of where he was when he was over this side of.
Well, it's very fortunate in that with football, you could track somebody week by week in the newspapers.
Ah,
You know
right,
where
yeah,
they
of
are.
course.
And for a very short time, he was still on the books for Manchester United. He played for Rochdale, for example,
Ah, right.
and he played for Clapton Orange,
Oh.
which is now Leighton Orient.
Ah, right, okay.
And so you can track where he was, what he was doing. But by the time he was, when he was playing for Clapton Orient, Leighton Orient, that is now, he was, I imagined that the marriage was under a great deal of strain.
Right.
And he could go down to London, where one of his brothers lived, and it was a way of escaping from the family, with his wife and the children. And yet he could play football there. So it was ideal for him.
Right.
Perhaps not for the family, but for him it was fine.
Yeah, yeah. And that's where the sort of strife starts in the story, isn't it, between his wife Ellen and himself. I was interested in the way you tell the story because you've mentioned newspaper articles, and there are one or two newspaper articles through the book. Are they genuine newspaper articles?
No,
You've invented those.
I wrote those. I imagined what was going to happen, and so I wrote it in a newspaper article. There are one or two real authentic documents, copies of, in the book, but most of the newspaper articles, I read something and then wrote it in my own words.
Right. And also you've used like a letter form, haven't you? So there's letters from Patrick to his brother Larry.
Yes.
And there's letters from his later love, which we'll get on to.
Yeah, his second love.
Are they real letters?
No.
No, so you fictionalised those as well?
I fictionalised those.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I do not have any copies of letters from him to his brother, but I just imagined them over time so I could tell Larry, or the reader, what was going on, what was happening through the war, the Spanish Civil War, with football, and with the trip to Mexico. Give all the details.
Yeah. And why did that idea come to you then? If you didn't have I wondered if you had like a pile of letters that you were sifting through when you were researching. So what made you decide to do it in that form? It's not all in letters, is it? But there are quite a lot of letters. What drew you to that way of telling the story?
Well, I've always liked letters, ever since I was young. I used to have lots of pen friends, and I always enjoyed letters. I enjoyed writing letters. And to me it seemed an ideal way of telling Larry, telling the reader, what was going on. A bit more about Spain, a bit more of the political situation, a bit more of his life. And so you could include all those in a very short piece of work.
Yeah, I like that, because particularly at the time of the Civil War, for instance, there's not just a load of information about the Civil War and who was fighting who. You learn about it through the characters, don't you, and what they're experiencing, and some, you know, in some circumstances, some quite horrible incidents that they're telling each other via letter. So that really brought it to life. I enjoyed that.
Yes.
I know you've done a creative writing MA, haven't you?
I did.
Was that before you started doing this research, or was that after?
Well, it was as I was doing it. I spent a lot of time researching Patrick's life. And I did the MA at Bolton, University of Bolton, in the middle of it, I suppose. And I'd started writing about Patrick, but it helped me focus my thoughts, focus what I was doing. And the piece, well, it was what I did for my MA.
Right, right.
Patrick.
So you presented this as your MA work?
Yes.
Right, that's interesting. And I know you have useful skills for this particular topic just by coincidence, I believe, that you speak Spanish.
I speak Spanish.
You've lived in Barcelona.
I've lived in Madrid. I lived in Madrid for 5 years, I think. Yes.
Yeah.
I speak Spanish. I can read Spanish. I chase up articles in Spanish newspapers.
That's really handy. So, okay, well, what we'll do, Sue, in the next half, if you'll join us in the next half, we'll look a bit more closely at the story and about Patrick and his relationship to your family. Hello and welcome back to About Books. Joining us today is Sue O'Connell, author of this book, The Man Who Saved Barcelona, The Remarkable Life of Patrick O'Connell. And just before the break, we were talking about the fact that you have Spanish, you've lived in Spain, a lot of this story is based in Spain. You've also, I believe, lived in Mexico.
That's right.
And some of the story is based in Mexico, isn't it? It seems to me that this story is a match made in heaven for you.
I've often felt that it was something waiting for me. Because of the language, because of the places. And so it was sort of, I've seen it as sort of compensation sometimes for my MS.
Ah, that's interesting. Yeah. And as we were saying earlier, Patrick O'Connell is related to you. He's your husband's grandfather, that's right, isn't it?
It is, yes, he was my husband's grandfather.
Now, as I was reading the book, it's all about Patrick O'Connell, and he's a fascinating man. But I just thought he wasn't the kindest man to the people around him. And as a reader, I was kind of judgy of him. I was saying, oh, you know, you shouldn't have done that, you shouldn't have done this. But you as a writer don't seem to judge him at all.
Well, I think over time I became quite fond of him, I suppose. I spent so long working on him, researching him. I think perhaps I've forgiven some of his sins. People are more interesting. Human frailties are more fascinating than somebody who's organised, run-of-the-mill, kind, goes home every night. Patrick didn't do that.
No, he certainly didn't, did he? And yet his first family, he had 4 children, is that right?
He had 4 children, yes, with his first wife.
And he abandoned them when the children were quite young, weren't they?
Yeah, probably, let me think now, Dan would have been about 6, I think, the last time.
And was he the youngest child?
He was the youngest, yes.
Yeah. And which of the children is your husband? Is your husband's father, sorry.
Husband, yeah. The eldest. My husband is the son of the eldest child, who is also called Patrick.
Right.
His namesake.
Yeah. And you knew the daughter Nell quite well, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nell was the third of the 4 children and knew her quite well. We saw her quite often. She's continued to live in Manchester. In fact, in very early days, when I met my husband, the grandfather's wife, Ellen, was still alive. She was in her 90s, and she was quite frail and didn't really know didn't participate very much, but she was alive, and she died when she was 96.
Did she know you were writing this story about her husband?
At this time, I wasn't writing it.
Ah, right.
She died before I started the book.
Right. And what about Nell then, his daughter? Did she know you were writing it?
She did. She had a rose-coloured view of her father, and 1 or 2 things she didn't like, and so she just said they didn't happen. It wasn't like that, so I left it.
So what kind of things would those be that she denied?
Well, when he got involved in a scandal, And there is a scandal that he was involved in. In 1915, there was a betting scandal. Manchester United, Liverpool FC. And it was organised by allegedly, it was organised by some people, that not only that Liverpool would win, but a score of 2-0.
Right.
And that suited both teams very well with regards to relegation and what have you. So both teams would stay in the first division and everybody would be happy. But some sharp-eyed bookies recognised family who put on considerable bets to get a particular outcome in the match,
Right.
which was quite unusual.
This was when Patrick was captain of
He was
United.
captain of Manchester United.
So he must have known.
He almost certainly knew about it. The match apparently was a travesty,
Right.
an absolute travesty. And there was a penalty. Somebody was going to take the penalty, and he always got the goal. But Patrick took the penalty instead. And he practically hit the corner post,
Right.
which just fitted in with the tone of the match. There were lots of catcalls and boos and whistles, and people knew there was something going on. Players were arguing not over the match, but to get the score. Don't you dare score anything else.
Right. Gosh.
So
That's a very modern story, isn't it? Because we've had
Not
match
quite.
fixing
Yeah.
sort of scandals more recently, haven't we, in recent years? Yeah.
well, I think wherever there's money, you're going to get something like that.
Yeah. And yet Nell, the daughter, who idolised her father, did she? She denied he had anything to do with that.
Oh, he wouldn't have had. No, it just sort of faded it out, blanked it out.
But how old was she when he left?
Let's see. She would have been 7 when he left completely, but probably last time she saw him, she was about 5.
Gosh, so she didn't know him at all, did she? Really?
She had some incredible memories of him. He came home driving a car. You think, well, so what? But in 1918, 1919, to be able to drive was something really special. Very few people could do that.
Right.
He brought a car home to where they lived, and they went up and down the street, apparently. She was hanging on at the window. She was standing on the running board, hanging on the window. Health and safety now would have a fit if they knew this. But then people didn't bother. And the other children from the street, they'd had rides up and down too, some of the neighbours. It was something very unusual.
So how did it... I'm quite interested that there's Nell in the story, who you knew personally.
Yes.
There's also your own husband, Mike, makes a little appearance. I say little appearance because he's a very little boy when he
He's a
appears
child,
in the
yes.
story.
Yeah.
How did it feel about writing and kind of fictionalising people that you knew in real life?
With Nell, I enjoyed writing it because I'd heard some of her stories. It sounds awful. I'd heard them so often. She told me them again and again and again. When she got older, she would repeat these stories. I thought, oh yes, I know which story it is. But they were fascinating, and I didn't find it that difficult to fictionalise her. I could imagine her, the way she became later on. But with my husband, I found it very difficult. Trying to think myself into him as a little child.
Yeah, yeah. Because this whole story and Patrick, his grandfather, has had an impact on Mike's life as well, hasn't it?
It has.
Can you tell us anything about that?
My husband's always said that because his father didn't have a father, he was no good as a father himself.
Right.
And Mike was actually brought up by his grandmother Ellen, Patrick's wife, his aunt Nell, and her husband.
Right.
Not by his own parents.
And that's why you were quite close to Nell then, because she was a sort of surrogate parent for your husband.
Exactly. She was she was more or less his mother, sort of.
Right. Right. Yeah. Gosh, it's so. I find it very moving when I'm reading it because he leaves them, doesn't he? He sends a little bit of money sometimes.
Yes.
And then eventually he just seems to decide, oh well, they're not my problem anymore.
He's done his bit.
Yeah. Even when they're still, children, it seems. And then he went to Spain and he kind of repeated history, didn't he?
Exactly.
Can you tell us about how he did that?
Well, he went to Santander which is in the north of Spain. And we think that's where he met his second wife. He remarried bigamously, and his second wife was Irish and called Ellen.
Mm.
And when I found that out, I thought, what's happened? You know, I couldn't believe it for a while, but it happened. We met the second Ellen's family, and got a feel for what he'd been up to. And somebody in the family said they always thought there was a story behind it.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. And she never knew she was married bigamously, did she? The second Ellen.
I don't think so until very late in the
Yeah.
marriage, very late in their lives.
There's a very moving scene in the book, actually,
Thank you.
where you don't you're not very explicit about what's happening. You leave it to the reader to surmise. But yeah, that's a very moving scene where Ellen clicks what's been going on,
Yeah.
and that they're quite advanced in their marriage at that stage, aren't they? How long had they been married then? Married, I mean, not really
yes.
married.
Probably about 20 years, if not more.
Right.
Yeah. And she didn't know. But what happened was that one of Patrick's sons traced him to Spain.
Right.
He asked, when the Spanish national football team played in Dublin, if anybody knew of a relative of his, Patrick O'Connell, and they'd all heard of him. I mean, information didn't flow like it does now, so people didn't know from one country to another what was going on. Nobody knew. So they knew about Patrick. Of course, he was a big name in football, a big name as a manager. So Dan wrote to his father, and the father replied. So Dan decided he was going to go and meet his father. It took him a year to save up. He went to Seville, where his father was at the time, and he met his father for the first time in 30 years. And he had to pretend he was a nephew from Dublin.
Right.
It was quite entertaining on one level for Dan, but on another level I think it hurt him a lot.
It must have hurt him to be denied as a son.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he didn't ask after the family, did he? Patrick didn't ask after his family when he met Dan.
Didn't ask after his family, didn't ask after his other children. His main question when he met Dan was, how was Manchester United getting on?
Yeah. Which sums the man up, really, doesn't it? Yeah. And Ellen was aware, in the story anyway, Ellen's aware that this Dan, this nephew, is visiting and wants to meet him, doesn't she? And she's puzzled
That she doesn't meet him.
Why she doesn't get to meet him. Yeah.
She just thinks it's because he's young and he doesn't think about these things, so he just clears off.
Yeah.
And he goes down to the coast.
Yeah. There's so much fascinating in this story, and we haven't even really got onto the football or the man himself in his later life. So so everybody's going to have to read the book, because we're going to have to wind it up there now. So,
right.
But thanks so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure, and
Well,
thank you for watching.